Hi everyone, my name is Gabby. I'm a senior studying international relations and art history. Thank you all so much for coming out today to listen to my project entitled Towards a Livable Future, the Implementation and Legislation of the 15-Minute City. I was advised by Professor Glick in the Department of Political Science, and I just wanted to give a special thank you to him for his guidance and patience throughout this entire process. So to begin, my research centers on an experimental urban planning approach, but before I really get into it, I'm sure some of you may be wondering how I arrived at this topic, given my major, and the explanation for that is actually quite simple because international relations is a multidisciplinary field dedicated to examining and then resolving major world issues, and most experts today agree that climate change is the defining crisis of our time. So I kind of knew from the very beginning that I wanted the climate crisis to feature into my Keystone, at least in some capacity. And then about a year ago, I encountered an article about the so-called 15-minute city. And my interest was really piqued because of its environmental origins. And in the article, the authors were identifying cities as both the biggest contributors, but also the biggest sufferers of climate change. And so I found that dual identity very interesting. So to give you an overview of what the 15-minute city is, it's a proposed multi-benefit solution that aims to combat the precarious position of cities today. And it was first developed in 2016 by a Franco-Colombian scientist and professor named Carlos Moreno, but it didn't really rise to prominence until 2020 when the mayor of Paris incorporated it into her re-election campaign. Its chief goal is to reconfigure the city according to notions of hyperproximity and localization in order to provide a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient urban space for city inhabitants. So to that end, the whole design plan calls for reforms that will bring 6 essential social functions: living, working, commerce, healthcare, education, and entertainment into distances that take no more than 15 minutes to travel by foot or by bicycle. This vision puts an end to vehicle over-reliance, and it's really reintroducing a human scale back into the urban landscape. It's sometimes called a city without a center or a city of many centers because it reimagines the current city as an integrated network of self-sufficient but interacting neighborhood parcels. So while much of my research really was about identifying and explaining what 15-minute city is in general, I also followed that up with a few more complex research questions, one of them being how does the campaign for 15-minute cities compare to other policy change movements, and then how can its advocates ensure its implementation. And to answer those questions, I combined a few different methodological approaches, and then I divided my paper into 2 discrete parts. So part 1 is an intellectual history of urban planning, and then part 2 is an exploration of adjacent policy change movements. So for part 1, I conducted a literature review of planning beginning in the 1880s, mostly just because that's when urban planning became a scholarly discipline. And I traced a selective genealogy of the most prominent figures and popular visions within the field, paying particular attention to those plans that exerted tremendous and lasting influence on the urban landscape, but ultimately proved detrimental to the quality of life in metropolitan areas. Also within part 1, I started to look at the literature on the 15-minute city plan itself, but it is very limited because it's quite young. And so I also sort of combine that with an exploration of a few cities in the world that have either begun implementing the 15-minute plan or sort of already adhere to that configuration. So that includes cities like Paris, Milan, Barcelona, Portland, and Bogota. And then I transitioned to part 2 of my paper, which is where I referred to the more general policy change literature. And I drew from multiple different texts to identify key mechanisms that individuals or organizations use to mobilize and affect tangible change. And following that up with an application of those identified mechanisms to 2 real-world movements, affordable housing and bicycle advocacy, to sort of determine and evaluate their performance in accordance to those mechanisms and whether or not it helped them meet their objective. So in its quest to revitalize the urban landscape, the 15-minute city hinges on 4 key principles: proximity, diversity, density, and ubiquity. And I'm not really going to go into what all of them mean because I don't have time, but it's sufficient to say that they're all sort of focused on bringing this smaller scale neighborhood complex to the larger city by ensuring that critical amenities saturate the environment. What's particularly important about this part of my project, and I guess this was sort of a critical juncture in the whole process, was that I realized there are a ton of design principles to ensure the implementation of the 15-minute city, but there are very few political prescriptions to accompany those principles. So relevant stakeholders have a hard time identifying how they could actually make changes a reality. You would assume that in a plan like this, there would need to be, new zoning codes or maybe a cap on vehicles with high carbon emissions, but we don't really know yet, and a lot of policymakers don't know how to bring about those changes. So in webinars and online fora, people expressed interest in the 15-minute city, but they were concerned that would be left on the political back burner because of its underdeveloped nature. So, in light of the gulf between what is imagined and what is possible, I turned to policy change literature, as I mentioned earlier, as a source to sort of supplement my exploration and provide an instructive path forward. And so through all this, I found 5 key mechanisms of policy change movements, or that policy change movements regularly use when lobbying for their objective, and these include securing a wide spectrum of allies, building coalitions, constructing a collective identity, crafting a compelling narrative, and then lastly, sustaining political will. And that brings me to my case studies. So I applied the criteria to the real-world movements that I mentioned earlier, affordable housing and bicycle advocacy, in both California and New York, and I sort of assessed whether or not they were successful according to that criteria, looking at both successful and unsuccessful movements. Yeah. And so through all of this, I was able to develop prescriptions for the future, and they're not all listed here, and I can't really go through all of them in detail, but a huge theme throughout the process was the idea of planning with communities, not for communities. I also found that political will is best sustained in movements that work on the local level, so I urge 15-minute proponents to practice grassroots advocacy whenever possible, and this also entails adjusting the target level of governance. So maybe working on a municipal level rather than a federal level or even in sort of like an international scope. And then I also recommend that the 15-minute city advocates broaden their audience base by accentuating just how encompassing their mission is, because if it's implemented correctly, 15-minute city should combat climate change, reduce social inequality, and restore a sense of community to the city. So it's obvious that it encompasses a lot of different issues that many different individuals should be interested in. And then another one I also thought of was just sort of appealing to underserved communities, because the plan will inevitably help them, but a lot of people don't know what the 15-minute city entails. And while it exists in the lexicon of urban planning, I think it could be sort of alienating for a regular person to hear the term and think of it just as an urban planning change when really it encompasses a lot of other issues. Okay, so lastly, the significance of the 15-minute city is, I guess the obvious one is climate change is very immediate, and we need to build more adaptable and resilient cities. More than 50% of the world lives in urban areas right now, and that number is only predicted to grow. So we really do need solutions, and we need them quickly. And then my own research is significant because it's bringing the political dimension to the project that it currently lacks, and it's providing future suggestions for effective implementation. Thank you for listening, and I can answer any questions.
Hi. So I'm wondering, in your research, did you encounter any interaction between like advocates of the 15-minute city and NIMBYism, like people who are sort of reactionary against development?
That's a good question. I didn't really encounter it firsthand, but I know that NIMBYism is sort of fundamentally against these sorts of movements because NIMBYism perpetuates social inequality, and that's sort of opposite of what's going on here. So yeah, I didn't encounter it directly, but I do know that there's sort of a dissonance between those two platforms.
Thank you so much. Sort of as a follow-up question to that, you mentioned the need to plan with communities, and I'm curious how you square that very understandable desire with the fact that existing public comment processes are often dominated by a pretty unrepresentative minority that's trying to oppose all change, as David Glick found in his book.
Wait, can you repeat that one more time? Sorry. Or just, I missed like one word.
Sorry, so you mentioned the need to plan with communities, which I
Yeah.
think most of us would agree is very noble. But David Glick, in a book he co-authored, found that existing public comment practices are often really monopolized by a pretty unrepresentative minority of white wealthy homeowners, basically. So how do you square this desire to involve people in planning with the fact
Okay.
that existing public comment practices
Yeah.
don't really do what we would hope?
Yeah. So in a lot of the groups I was actually looking at, and this isn't for the 15-minute city group because those are kind of in their infancy, but for affordable housing and bicycle advocacy, a lot of the groups are actually really, really grassroots. So a lot of their plans are actually bringing people into the movement, but then advancing them up to the leadership so that they are prescribing solutions for change and they live within the community that the change is going to affect. So I think that's one of the ways where there's like a pipeline for local individuals to I guess, inform the way that this movement is going to come about.
Great job. I'm just wondering if there are any parts of the world where implementing the 15-minute city might be more difficult than others.
Yeah, so in European cities, and especially just in older cities in general, where there's a historic city configuration, they tend to be more decentralized in general. So it should be easier there, and a lot of them already sort of meet some of the requirements. So Barcelona and Milan, they're much closer to achieving the 15-minute city than, say, Boston is, because the U.S. has really high car over-reliance, and urban sprawl is a huge phenomenon here. So it definitely depends on the local context in which people are planning to implement it.